When it comes to queer rep in media and our relationships to it, there's a million different angles anyone could take. I've talked about queer rep in Overwatch before, I've talked about non-binary character design, I've talked about queer baiting, and on the same day I put out this video, I also put out one on a study I did about what correlations exist between character and role choices in Overwatch and Rivals with a player's sexuality, gender, and position. Other creators and writers over the years have explored it from tons of other perspectives, and when I was originally working on this subject with Ocean the Harpy, my top donor from my October donathon who got to pick the topic for this video, one of my concerns was that I didn't want to just retread the same subjects everyone else had already covered. See, initially the idea was to talk about the way that queer people have frequently embraced our portrayal as monsters or villains, whether that's identifying with the antagonist, the evil, or just the queer-coded Disney villains. But that is a subject that's kind of been done before, and I didn't think there was a ton I could add to it. Plus, in real life, we aren't being seen the same way anymore. We're not seen as uniformly villainous or a marginalized group deserving of marginalization in the same way as the era of the Hays Code. Even the people who hate us don't hate us in the way they once did. Like, you can find a pretty sizable contingent of conservatives who still watch Drag Race and might even actively say they don't hate gay people while still voting for politicians like Trump or Poilievre. Which, fun fact, he's now my member of parliament, so now I get to yell at him directly if he ever bothers to show up in my fucking district. I am reminded of right-wing Canadian politician who 1000% has claimed to have a gay best friend so she gets to say it, Michelle Rempel-Garner, who, during the 2021 Canadian election, pitched the legalization of poppers as part of their platform while ignoring the reality that the Conservative Party had spent the end of the previous parliament fighting tooth and nail against a conversion therapy ban. They'll hate gay people, but not the ones they know. They hate the bad gays, not the good normal ones who don't just watch Drag Race and shop and know how to be some real men. Or alternatively, they only like the ones who will be the human form of a purse dog, and they don't want a gay who exists as a real three-dimensional person. They will simultaneously pretend to offer the illusion of dignity while fundamentally believing in the inherent indignity of queerness. These people are not known for ideological consistency in the face of personal enjoyment and entertainment. And also, it must needs be remarked that many of these people are very dumb. Like, they still don't know what Born in the USA is about. But that got me thinking about how we are perceived in the modern day. And I realized that the stereotypes have shifted in an interesting direction. For one, we're no longer the villains, at least not in the theatrical, queer-coded Disney villain kind of way. There's still bigots out there who see us as evil, but queerness is not inherently seen as synonymous with villainy or maliciousness or deceit or wrongness in the way it was in the age of the Hays Code. Instead, particularly in gaming spaces, I think the stereotype and trope has instead shifted in the direction of the support, of the healer, the ally, the friend. That doesn't just go for the characters that we get, but also the perception of them and the people who play them. Like I said, I just did a whole study into what kinds of characters queer people main in games like Overwatch and Rivals, but there's a flip side to that of what characters and roles are perceived as more gay. Hell, if we really wanted to get into it, there are characters that are perceived as being played by either bottoms or by tops within queer communities, signaling how we've really changed how we perceive this stuff. And that, to me, is really interesting. How did queerness go from horrors to healers? And what does it mean that we've seen the shift in this direction? There's still certainly an affinity for the villains, but there's also definitely been a change-up, and that's what I want to explore. Before we get fully into it, just a couple quick comments. First, as I said, this is one of two videos being released simultaneously. The other one is a study into who the girls, gays, and theys main, and why, which is a video about a fun pilot study I conducted into how character preferences correspond to gender, sexuality, and position. That video will cover some more data analysis on the subject, so if you want more of this, I'd suggest watching that one after this one's done. Second, time's running out to pre-order the Viv Wiggler pins. The campaign will end on September 5th, and we're only a few pre-orders away from the campaign succeeding, so if you want one, make sure to place your pre-order. This is especially the case for the Americans, because thanks to the tariff policy of the United States, the shipping company that Airlia, the person who makes the pins, uses will no longer be shipping to the US directly for the foreseeable future. We're going to be doing a workaround for the pre-orders where she'll ship them to me and I'll get them to Americans who ordered them on my own dime, but since I'll be taking on that extra cost myself, I'm only going to be doing that for pre-orders. In other words, if you're an American who wants a Wiggler pin, it'll have to be a pre-order unless tariffs suddenly change up. For everyone else, pre-orders will still be handled as normal, so make sure to get them in ASAP so the campaign can succeed. Anyways, with that out of the way, let's get into it properly, starting with Part 1. Heroes versus Villains. For the last 100 or so years up until pretty recently, queerness in media was primarily portrayed as trickster behavior at best and nefarious or evil at worst. And queer villainy was usually playing off of tropes of predation, deception, and the threat to the family unit and gender roles. So it's worth exploring those a bit in order to identify how this changeover happened. First and foremost, we need to get the Hays Code out of the way. The Hays Code was a conservative policy in Hollywood that required certain social values to be maintained through film. One of which was basically that queer people could never be the good guys. Homosexuality was a sin, and if it must be shown, then it must be shown being penalized. That obviously played a big role in this stuff, but it is worth acknowledging that it wasn't like this was something where Hollywood was way out of step with mainline views. Gay people were not perceived positively back in the day, and it's worth examining why. After all, it's not really biblical, and as someone who spent a lot of years at Catholic school and going to Christian summer camps, I can actually say that with some authority. As well, those modern bigotries and stereotypes aren't from the Bible either. Those are modern conventions based in modern social, political, and cultural perceptions. One of the big things was this perception of the gays as trying to prey on children, either violently preying on them and assaulting them, or seducing them into this life of debauchery by turning them gay. They would either attack them outright or lure them into complacency to a point of not seeing it as an attack at all. The implication is that the gays were a danger to your children, which is probably why a lot of those queer-coded villains ended up in kids' media. Initially, the goal was presumably to get kids to conflate queerness and evilness, but especially when you think about later queer-coded Disney villains, including those written by queer writers like Ursula, it's clearly being done in a way that's playing into queerness for theatrics rather than threats. However, it also goes beyond children. Adults also felt like they were at risk, and given how much of this media was written by straight men, a lot of the media portrayals reflected their own hang-ups. When you accept a boys will be boys worldview towards men, you assume that all men will act the same and justify that to some extent. And, if you're not careful, that might include queer men. And if you as a man excuse casual sexual harassment of women by men as just being how men are, then you will logically conclude that gay men will treat you the same way if given the chance, and that that's not acceptable, and don't ask why we have a double standard there. Lesbians were going to steal away their women, the concern being based on the perception of women as property, and lesbians were already a -1 of the women that men could have, so it's not a good thing if they take another one with them. This is assuming, of course, that they didn't believe in corrective assault towards lesbians to try and turn them straight. Trans people, for people who don't understand gender, are basically just those concerns amplified. Trans men perceived as the theft of a woman from the available supply and a almost stolen valor of masculinity, and trans women as just men in disguise. The deception of it all is also a big part of this. The queers are lurking everywhere. Anyone could be a gay and you might not even know. There's a reason why the lavender scare coincided so neatly with the red scare. In the same way that communists would often only identify each other by little winks and nods and small hints that a non-commie wouldn't pick up, queer people of past decades would often have to find ways to secretly communicate with one another using code phrases, gestures, and other subtle indicators. This was done because being openly queer was dangerous, but a problem that cishet people created for queer people was now being just weaponized against them. The perception was that gay men and women as well as trans people were only acting like quote-unquote normal people to get into these spaces and try to either prey on them or tempt them into their sinful lives, with a particular focus on children as targets. It was bullshit then, and it is bullshit now. It is also crucial to recognize that this is a suppression of basic constitutional rights in countries like Canada and the US, in much the same way as McCarthyism at large was. Queer people have the same rights and freedoms regarding speech, association, and identity as everyone else. And while it's really easy to point to repression in far-off countries as justification for military action or why we don't view them as equals, it's important to recognize that places like Canada, the United States, and the United Kingdom in particular are experiencing walkbacks on basic human rights for queer people that should be identified for what they are. And of course, there's the threat to the norms that we must acknowledge. Queerness poses a threat to the nuclear family at a basic level because it posits that gender roles are unnecessary. At a minimum, it means they're changeable and non-permanent, but at worst, they're just outright arbitrary. If a relationship can work with 2 men or 2 women instead of just a man and a woman, and especially if they can raise children in a healthy, sustainable way, that means that the division of labor, responsibilities, and expectations between men and women in society as it relates to the family unit is not essential, is not fundamental, is not natural law that must be followed or else catastrophe will follow. Lots of people, especially women, were able to recognize that their circumstances in life were not fair. But as Naomi Smalls once said, life's not fair. A lot of people will eventually just suck it up and deal if it's an unchangeable fairness. But if queer people can prove that the unfairness is neither essential nor unchangeable, well, that calls the validity of the norm into question. Transitioning similarly implies that gender is not some permanent unchanging thing that you were born into, a cast you must simply grit your teeth and bear, but rather something you experience on a personal level and evolve alongside. And that's scary if you're a man in a patriarchal society where your power comes from some fundamental unchangeability of your innate masculinity, and the subservient relationship that the innate femininity of women has to it. Beyond that, queerness poses both an external threat as well as an internal one for families, particularly in the past where views were less tolerant. And I mean, even if we set aside the cherry-picked religious doctrines, a gay son or lesbian daughter was someone who would need to either change their ways or they'd be the end of the bloodline. What's more, if your son was gay, people might start to whisper. After all, there must be a defect at play if that happened, right? Were you a failure as a father in providing a strong masculine role model? Did you as a mother feminize your son in some way? Did you provide a gay gene? Does that mean you might be gay? Whether it's nature or nurture doesn't really matter here because you are ultimately going to be seen as responsible for both. Media of the time reflected these kinds of tropes. Queer coding your villain communicated deceptiveness, underhanded trickery, malicious seduction, and upsetting the natural order of things. This was aided by the reality that the marginalization of queer people pushed us into more risky situations, including drugs, sex work, and more. And being queer was legitimately very dangerous for a lot of people. Not because it's innately dangerous to be queer, but because a homophobic, transphobic society will make it dangerous. If you're that marginalized, not only are you forced to take more risks, you're also unable to call for help. Police are not your allies as queer people, not now and not ever. And as we experience this backsliding of human rights, we have to remember that. When you can't call for help and people are putting you in a position where hurting you is socially acceptable, you're being put in danger by the society around you. This goes beyond, gay bashing as well. The AIDS epidemic was undeniably exacerbated by homophobia, by the desire of a conservative Republican government, and Ronald Reagan in particular, to see queer people punished for their sin, to actively stand in the way of medical research, to prevent anyone from doing anything to help. Medical establishments, doctors, people in positions of authority, a lot of them let people die because they didn't want to help. They felt that we were undeserving of help. And that makes queerness dangerous. Not the queerness itself, but the refusal to do what would be done for any other person in that scenario. And now it's worth acknowledging that queer people have responded to the caricaturization of us in media in an interesting way. Namely, frequently by just embracing a bigoted stereotypical presentation of us rather than trying to disprove it, by leaning in and daring anyone to really push back. Name a stronger relationship than a homosexual man and the unquestionably evil fictional woman and or queer-coded villain he can't help run defense for. You can't. Gays love their villains, especially now that it seems like honestly the queer-coded ones are fewer and further between. However, we're talking about how we made this transition from villains to heroes, and a reason for that is that these tropes just don't hold the same kind of cultural cachet that they once did. Familiarity does a lot to kill stereotyping, and as people became more familiar with queer people and it became more acceptable, it just didn't seem so villainous. Queer people weren't forced to lurk in the shadows for survival. We weren't forced to hide our identity so much, and we were able to demonstrate that queer families being allowed to exist doesn't result in all the horses eating each other. And as a result, we were perceived less as these sort of shadow-dwelling secretive family wreckers. We have been humanized in society in a way that makes it just less effective, narratively speaking, to use queerness as some sort of shorthand for villainous behavior. And that in turn has opened the door for us to become good guys without having to find a way to hide or excuse our queerness in the first place. Part of the challenge that this presents, however, is that nobody really knows what it means to make a character obviously queer without relying on the negativity associated with queer coding or stereotypes that existed to communicate queerness by and for a straight audience, rather than to feel representative of queer people. You can kind of see this in characters like Tracer and Soldier 76, who are meant to be good guys and whose queerness is blink and you might miss it levels of subtle, in contrast to the iconic queer-coded Disney villains like Ursula, Scar, or even Gaston, where the stereotypes in queer coding can be pretty hard to miss. I personally think this is a big part of the reason why queer people still frequently gravitate to the evil gays trope, especially since in the present day it's relatively toothless. Nobody wants to do a homophobia, and nobody knows how to do an Ursula without potentially accidentally doing a homophobia, but nobody knew how to do a gay Ariel in the first place and make her compelling. That's not to say it's impossible to do a queer reading of The Little Mermaid. There is a pretty long legacy of that relating to, the author, but time and place, simply not the place for it right now. The evil queers are the ones who are the most flamboyant and stereotypical and, frankly, fun. And part of why a lot of positive queer rep has been underwhelming is, in my opinion, because people don't know how to make queerness fun for the good guys in the same kind of way they know how to do it for villains. Now, obviously, this stuff happens on a huge global cultural scale, so we have to narrow it down a bit to the world that I focus on, namely gaming. And specifically, we're going to look at Overwatch. I would argue that a really notable turning point is actually Lifeweaver, who feels like he does finally thread the needle of being flamboyant and stereotypical and fun while still being a good guy. It also helps that he's still operating outside the law, even though it's for a good cause, having stolen his BioLite technology back from Vishkar to try and use it to repair the environment and help people. And that also plays into something else worth mentioning. Queerness has often been a supporting character trait, not really a main character trait. And that actually does reflect some real-world stereotypes that do exist. Stuff like lesbian aunts and gay uncles who don't have kids of their own and so spoil their nieces and nephews rotten are a more modern example. But historically, we could look to how indigenous societies that recognized two-spirit identities often saw those people filling roles in medicinal or spiritual leadership. There's a theory that the evolutionary advantage of homosexuality is that it deliberately creates a certain percentage of the population who are ostensibly just guaranteed to not reproduce naturally, which in turn guarantees there will always effectively be spare adults capable of being caregivers for everyone else's kids and who can continue contributing to the labor force without the risk that they'll eventually have kids of their own. Regardless, this is a stereotype that's become prevalent in the modern age as an effort to replace the negative stereotypes of the past. That queer people are supporters, helpers, healers, friends. They are your neighbors. Love is love. They aren't hurting anyone. They just want to be able to live their lives freely. They're the gunkles and the lesbian aunts, the ones who are meant to bring some culture to the table at Thanksgiving and always have a clever quip. The L's, the G's, the B's, the T's, and the Q's are here as your supporting cast. But that comes with some complications of its own. Part 2. If you're both men, who's the DPS and who's the support? One of the big issues in queer spaces is that ultimately we do indeed still live in a society. We're not just instantly freed from things like gender roles, including people who have transitioned and people in same-sex relationships. Gay men in particular have really mastered this craft of basically saying, well, there might be no women in this relationship, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't be the man. And so there's this weird insistence on treating bottoms as basically the woman in a relationship and tops as the man. Once you see that, you can really see how gay men basically just copy-pasted misogyny into this dynamic. You know, bottoms be shopping, bottoms can't drive, bottoms are so emotional, bottoms are the stay-at-home party in the relationship. Bottoms be watching reality TV and yas queening and all this other stuff. A sexually active top isn't perceived as a slut in the way that an equally active bottom is. And there's kind of an assumption of bottoms being less emotionally and intellectually competent than tops. They're prone to getting emotional, to making stupid mistakes, and then being flustered when some strong dom top says it's okay and calls them a good boy. Queer men are still men at the end of the day and are largely socialized as such. Ironically, in a more tolerant society that's willing to accept homosexual masculinity as a valid form of masculinity, it also becomes easier for queer men to internalize the sense that as men, they should get to be the man in the relationship. Every part of the queer community has these sorts of internal issues. Queer women are still socialized as women, with all the baggage that brings under heteronormativity when it comes to gender dynamics. Trans men are often erased in discussions of trans issues, and trans women are often in a battle over passing public presentation and how best to navigate such a contentious political environment. And that's before even getting into the intersectionality of it all. Stuff like BBC-style racial fetishization still exists in queer spaces. From personal experience, I've had a shocking number of encounters where someone's either not interested in me until they learn I'm not Asian, or where someone is interested in me because they think I am until they learn the same fact. I even had one guy who explicitly said that I was, quote, the best of both worlds, because he thought I looked like the Korean men he fetishized, but I was actually white. Shit's crazy, guys. Actually, not really related, but kind of. One time I was shopping in Edmonton for Christmas presents, and a lady just randomly walked up to me and asked, "Are you BTS?" And I was like, "The Korean boy band? Like all of them?" And she just said, "Yeah." And I was like, "No, of course not." And she was like, "Oh, well, like I'm just a big fan." And I was like, "And you thought that BTS were one person wandering around a strip mall in Edmonton, Alberta at Christmas? Party." Queer people of all genders and sexualities are still faced with pressure to conform to and perform their identity properly, and that can be complicated. Queer feminine men still have to perform it properly or else they'll be ridiculed by their fellow gays just as much as anyone else, and it's complicated further by the way that body image relates to this. Feminine men are meant to look the part in terms of things like hairlessness and slenderness that are often imposed onto women as part of the same thing, and feminine bears are treated almost like oxymorons rather than real people. Queer masculine women will likewise get these sorts of comments, treating them as if they've failed to perform properly. NBs are in an unenviable position, an unenviable position if you will, of being kind of damned if they do and damned if they don't when it comes to how to present gender outside the binary. But I already do have a video on that subject if you're interested. The challenge here is that these sorts of internal issues are really difficult to tackle effectively in terms of changing social perceptions and stereotypes. Nuance is hard to begin with, but especially hard when you're dealing with internal group dynamics as shaped by external factors. These are subjects better tackled internally before trying to make some sort of, Heartstopper or Love Simon style mainstream media about it. Like, cishet people still get all bent out of shape when you push back about subjects like women not wanting to date bi men who've bottomed because they think it makes them less of a man and accuse them of homophobia and biphobia in the process. They simply are not collectively at a point where we can trust them with subjects like how gay men replicate misogyny within same-sex environments, or transmedicalism, or whatever else. And so, while these issues exist and are exacerbated by broader social tensions around race, gender, nationality, and more, they largely aren't incorporated into the mainstream zeitgeist because, even if you could, that doesn't necessarily mean you should. Instead, their role in the narrative ends up being more between the lines. And an obvious example of that happening is how the stereotype that women play supports and not DPS has been adopted in queer men's gaming spaces and adapted to just substitute bottoms for women. And it makes sense that that's happened. If DPS and tank are masculine roles and support is a feminine role, then if you conflate topping with masculinity and bottoming with femininity, then you're going to treat DPS and tank as roles for tops and support as a role for bottoms. If behind every strong man there's a strong woman, then behind every strong top is a strong bottom. If the woman in the E couple is meant to pocket her man, then the bottom is meant to pocket his top. The bottom is there to support his man, his top, the way a good housewife, house husband, should. This goes beyond the internal though. If you associate queerness in men with femininity, you're also more likely to see support as a gay role for the same reason. While we internally as a group of queer men might make those distinctions, society at large, especially homophobes, don't give a shit. The Westboro Baptist Church doesn't think you're more of a man because you're a top. You're just maybe slightly less of not a man than a bottom. Maybe. But they'll lump us all together in here because it doesn't serve straight people in any way to make that distinction. And this sort of gender dissociation with arbitrary shit is common everywhere. Like, this is the same sort of thing as kids getting called the F slur for wearing a pink shirt. Pink is for girls, so if a boy is wearing pink, it's probably not because he's a girl, but he is doing the thing you associate with femininity. And if you also associate femininity with homosexuality, then you start to connect those dots. A feminine boy is gay because a gay boy is a non-masculine man by dint of his attraction to men. You see an infinite number of rage bait posts online about how if your man likes dessert, he's probably a bit fruity, and it's for the same reason. This does affect everyone, cis or trans, queer or straight, binary or non-binary. Masculinity is conflated with heterosexuality and femininity with homosexuality in cishet male contexts, and within queer spaces, topping and bottoming substitute for heterosexuality and homosexuality in that same comparison. And it's not like queer people have a monopoly on turning the broader cultural narrative about them into something internal to try and, create a pecking order. A lot of marginalized communities do the same sort of thing. Colorism frequently uses the same signifiers, connotations, and implications of darker skin that white supremacy posits, just adjusted to an internal community. You can see it in discourse among black communities about hair texture and skin darkness, or in the skin bleaching products that are popular in parts of Asia, and the discourse that exists in K-pop spaces regarding the skin lightening makeup that many idols wear. Marginalized communities are vulnerable to internalizing these narratives for themselves and then imposing them on people within their group to lift themselves up. And it's very possible to not even consciously realize that this is what you're doing, to think that it's just some sort of ironic comment, It's ironic that the bottoms be shopping, but eventually maybe stops being quite so ironic. And it's important to understand why those stereotypes emerge in the first place, especially given the unique social role of queerness. For a long time, most queer people would simply be closeted for safety and social security, because queerness is a marginalized identity that it is possible to hide in a way that things like race often aren't. And those who weren't hiding it were the ones who were either willing to live boldly and unapologetically, or those who just could not hide it. This means that stereotypes about queer people were often defined by people who already weren't necessarily favorable towards us, based on how they perceived the people who were the most radically unassimilated from the norms of the era. And I need to establish here, that is not to blame those people. Those people are not at fault for that, any more than the people who hid their identities because they were able to are better in some way. That's not the case. This is just the reality of how social perception works. The reason this matters is that it helps us to understand where this shift from scary to support has come from. We've discussed where the perception of queerness as villains came from, and if you've been paying attention, you've noticed that we've gone over how queerness has been moved into more of a supportive stereotype. But is that necessarily the full picture? Part 3. Obviously not. Yeah, so the reality is that this is a lot more complicated than I'm making it out to be. I've gotten some flack in the past for not diving deeper into the nuances of some of these subjects, particularly when it comes to stuff like intersectionality, and while I get where people are coming from, I do also worry about overstepping my bounds when it comes to making any sort of declarative statement about a community as broad and distinct as the queer community. My experiences are as a cis white gay guy from rural Alberta. While I do my best to learn, I'm never going to be the expert on the insanely diverse and often contradictory experiences of queer people across gender, race, nationality, and more. It's just sort of an inevitability of the situation. That being said, perfect is the enemy of the good. We can still dive into this stuff more, and I think it is worth it to do so. A lot of the gays or supports narrative kind of leaves out what it means for queer women, trans men, NBs, and more. This discussion often centers queer men, and it's typically to stereotype us into the more feminine roles. However, it's worth asking why. Why is that the direction that things are moving? I could make the joke that there are few things more masculine than two men together, but really think about it. What about being gay is inherently feminine? Historically, societies like the ancient Greeks tended to only view it as feminine if you were the bottom, but even beyond that, what part of that is inherently feminine? Is femininity defined by sexual attraction to men? Is it defined by being penetrated? Obviously not. We can identify people as being feminine even without either of those characteristics being apparent or even present at all. This is a retroactive application of femininity onto an act or characteristic because it suits cultural, social, and political ends. But it is clearly insanely reductive. When it comes to women, most people would recognize it as absurd to say that their femininity is defined by attraction to men or penetration by them. Femininity objectively exists far beyond the things that gay men do or at least share in common with women, and yet the connection is still made. And why does it feel like this doesn't necessarily move in the opposite direction in the same way? Why does a queer woman who puts on a strap not get the perks of masculinity? You could say it's just pure patriarchy, and I wouldn't say you're necessarily wrong, but I do think there's more to it than that, especially because many of the people who would conflate those things probably wouldn't view themselves as misogynistic, or at least not for doing that. A while ago, Todd in the Shadows did a review of Not Like Us where he made a comment about how, in spite of how pop music is taken more seriously today as a result of the poptimism movement of the 2000s, pop is still an insult when applied to anything that isn't pop. It's not an insult to call Lady Gaga pop, or to describe someone as liking pop music if they like Lady Gaga. However, it is an insult to Drake to call him a pop star, or to call a band like Nickelback's music pop music. The inference is that that makes them lesser than, they're not their true genre. It's a diminishing of what they do. If you say, oh, I love Paramore, and someone says, oh, so you're a pop fan, you're probably going to be rubbed the wrong way, even though Paramore does often get lumped into pop music. Hybrid genres like pop punk are a compliment if you're pop with a punk vibe, like Olivia Rodrigo, but if you're punk, getting called pop punk, it's still an insult. The reason I bring this up is because this is honestly how a lot of relatively progressive people view femininity, as something that is a downgrade from masculinity for anyone who is not a woman, but still something to strive towards for women, or at least not to penalize when women represent it. It bumps you down the totem pole, even if only subconsciously. One of the tricky things about social progress is that it's often much easier to treat a symptom than a cause. It's easy to say, okay, I view women as human beings and agree that we should not do misogyny or sexism to them. I mean, easy to say, not that enough people do, but whatever. But that doesn't mean that you've actually reevaluated how you feel about femininity, gender, and misogyny. All you've done is added a manual override for when you encounter a woman where that social conditioning tries to kick in and your brain says, no, it is wrong to say or think or do that to a woman. And so you don't say or think or do it, and where you consciously override the impulse to knock a woman down the totem pole for it. The social conditioning is still there, it's just lurking beneath the surface. And in theory, this is fine. If you view misogyny as something that exists exclusively in the context of don't do misogyny to women, then that'll do the job. Right up until the override doesn't apply. Until you encounter a scenario where you decide that someone is far enough removed from woman as a label that the override no longer kicks in, but femininity and your assumptions about it is still involved. That might mean non-binary people who present more femme, because even if you're respecting their identity with they-them pronouns, you're still picking up on gender markers and making a conflation there. That might mean queer women who you perceive as not performing femininity correctly, particularly butch women. That might mean queer men, either all or just specific subgroups of queer men, because you associate our sexuality with either a performance of femininity directly or indirectly as a failure to perform masculinity right. That might also mean women of color, either in general or specifically darker-skinned women, because Black, Indigenous, or Hispanic women tend to have their womanhood perceived very differently thanks to stereotypes and tropes about aggression, violence, size, or whatever else that we associate with their skin tone. And we can't forget that this can go for men too. Black, Indigenous, and Hispanic men are often treated as basically being dangerously masculine to the extent of lacking control and wanton violence, and both Asian men and women are often stereotyped as especially feminine, submissive, and docile. Whiteness in all of this is treated as neutral. For men, it is the civilized masculine. Yes, capable of violence and all these other things, but constrained by civilization. Femininity is delicate when white. And at this point, I think some people are probably just wondering why this shit matters. Like, who cares? Maybe you think I'm just overthinking it or whatever. And so it's time to dive deeper into why this is where we've ended up. Part 4. But why should I care? The reason this all matters is that these baseline stereotypes don't stop at this level, and when we don't disabuse ourselves of these stereotypes, we see them pop up when the override fails. And an obvious example of that is the way that queer men in particular have often been pushed into the same stereotypes and presumptions as women often are now that the scary parts of the stereotyping have begun to fade. This isn't to try and argue that like, oh, gay men are just as much a victim of misogyny as women. Obviously not. There is a fundamental difference here that relates to gender. And as part of that, it's also worth acknowledging that this isn't a simple transfer. Lesbian women don't suddenly get all the perks of masculinity. Like, not in society at large, but also not in gaming contexts. Nobody's like, hey, put the girl on Mercy. Oh wait, you have a girlfriend? All right, Widowmaker's yours. Like, there's still an assumption that people should be performing their gender roles in some way. And while treating queer men as a feminine substitute is basically treated as punishment enough in a society that values masculinity over femininity, the same doesn't work in reverse. The most obvious example in my mind is trans women, many of whom have a shared experience of being called a girl as an insult when they were growing up while they were still being identified as a boy, but now as women are being called men as an insult. When we talk about queerness moving from horror to healer, we're often talking about cis queer men. Trans men, trans women, NBs, and queer women aren't necessarily experiencing the same pressures. queer women in media are often presented in more traditionally masculine roles, either physical labor stuff like mechanics or construction workers or something, or professions treated as men's professions like law or finance. They don't really get that same move to healer because the perception about lesbians is that they're failing at that femininity in some way. And femininity is so closely associated with caregiving that their queerness and rejection of traditional gender roles is treated as synonymous with the distancing from that caregiving. This is something that, frankly, people just don't really know how to process in a lot of instances. I think the most common stereotype would be that butch lesbians are going to play tanks or something, but even then, it's not like they get a social upgrade to the perks of patriarchy or something. There's still a presumption that women are worse at games and so shouldn't be on DPS, or that mechanically demanding characters are simply out of their range, and owning a strap simply is not going to change that for people. NBs are often not really grappled with because it is still a relatively new concept for the mainstream, despite the fact that non-binary people have existed forever, and nobody really knows how they fit into things, although it's generally still not as a positive when it is presented. We can see this with how characters like Venture are presented, where people look at them and try and say, okay, you can say they're non-binary, but I read them as X, or I read them as Y. People will still try and find a way to pigeonhole them into a box so they can start making assumptions about them. Trans women are, frankly, most often presented in media, or at least historically have been, as sex workers, reflecting a cultural view of trans women that sees them as exploiting femininity for personal profit, while also tricking men out of their masculinity by presenting like a cis woman. Trans men are rarely represented at all, being one of the more invisible parts of the community, and that's not necessarily by accident. After all, a person transitioning from female to male would suggest that there's something that's not inherent about someone born with XX chromosomes that prevents them from being able to fulfill all these social roles of a man. And grappling with that might mean grappling with the reality that the scientific justification that people use for their treatment of women as lesser on a fundamental level is actually not really valid. And look, there are reasons why some of these stereotypes exist, but those reasons don't mean they're inherently valid assumptions about something inherent about these people. Queer men in same-sex relationships will inevitably have to take on caregiving roles that don't fit into the traditional view of masculinity, which makes them stand out as a man acting more in line with feminine expectations, even though they're not really doing anything particularly strange. Same with queer women in reverse, who will have to take on the sort of head of the household responsibilities that are often treated as masculine. Trans women often did work in sex work historically because that was all that was available to them in a discriminatory world. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of men were sexually interested in them throughout history, just like they are today. Trans men were often simply erased from history, lumping them in with cis women who just wore men's clothes for the sake of doing so, and or with lesbians who just presented more masculine. None of this is comprehensive, to be clear. There is far more to all of this than just what I'm saying here. But these are the sorts of things that lead to the stereotypes being seen as having a kernel of truth that validates their proliferation, even if the broader social context of why that happens can kind of nullify that. But it's also necessary to confront the reality that at the core, these stereotypes stem from more fundamental issues of perception around gender. Why is the caregiver role inherently feminine? Why is the head of the household presumed masculine? Why is it so socially accepted to sexualize and exploit trans women? Why is the erasure of trans men so consistent? At the end of the day, a lot of it stems from how deeply rooted misogyny is in society. It permeates everything we do, the roles we play in games, the jobs that we are allowed to do without being judged, the food and drink we can consume, the way we dress, everything. It isn't enough to just say that women are equal and leave it at that, because that doesn't really address this fundamental problem where femininity is still treated as less than. Having an override to say, but we should still treat women as equal, isn't the same as we reject misogyny, because the former doesn't stop those sentiments from influencing how we see women. And it especially does not stop those sentiments from emerging when it comes to femininity being expressed by someone who you don't see as a woman and therefore don't apply the override to. This video's goal isn't to try and convince you that gay people shouldn't play supports, or that queer characters shouldn't be healers, or that it's a bad thing that queerness is not seen as an inherently villainous attribute. And it is not to validate the stereotypes that exist around queer people of any stripe. Rather, it's to ask you why that connection exists, how it ties into this bigger cultural connotation of femininity and masculinity, and who benefits from this. Because it's not cishet women who are at best experiencing misogyny that is conditionally overridden by performing their gender properly while needing to try and navigate a patriarchal, often violently anti-women society. It is not cis queer men who are treated as though their sexuality is in direct contradiction with their gender and that living authentically is synonymous with failing to live masculinely. It is not cis queer women who are subject to pressures of comp het and the fetishization of their existence by straight dudes who think lesbians are hot. It's certainly not trans women who are treated as wolves in sheep's clothing because there's an assumption that the masculinity hidden beneath a thin veneer of performed womanhood is a threat of violence towards women, a deceptive seduction towards straight men, and a failure to conform to the proper role. None of that is true, to be clear. It's not trans men who are erased in nearly all of this discourse unless it's for people to mourn the loss of an otherwise viable woman. It's not NBs who are forced to fight an unwinnable battle where they reject a binary that is all-consuming in the dumbest of ways. It's not even really your average cishet men who are trapped in a spiral of not being able to express their emotions, preferences, or body without having to evaluate how much it hurts their credibility as men. And the reality is that, obviously, men still benefit the most from a system that sees masculinity as inherently more valuable than femininity. And cishet men, especially if they're white, able-bodied, etc., are going to benefit more than others. In fact, it's the precarity of their position within the in-group, the ease with which they can be stripped of their masculinity, that makes them more likely to reinforce the system in ways that harm themselves and everyone else. There are a lot of ways to perform masculinity in a way that will be recognized by other men, and while plenty of them are genuinely good things to do for people, those things are frankly also usually the harder ones. It's far easier to prove your masculinity in a patriarchal society by going the Andrew Tate route, and that incentive to perform your role doesn't stop existing at cis-het white men. As being gay gains social acceptance, there's also an incentive for queer men to try and use these same behaviors to reinforce their own masculinity, just within the context of a same-sex relationship towards male partners. Race also obviously plays a role in this. There's a very different dynamic that exists when there are two white gays as opposed to an interracial couple, and how we correlate masculinity and femininity with race means that the incentives to perform your role are going to be exacerbated even further. I mean, there's the basic associations that are made between race and size that definitely also correlate to masculinity in ways that I can't get into on YouTube without being demonetized, but thankfully those stereotypes are so baked in that you know what I'm talking about without me needing to actually say it explicitly. Queer black men are expected to be dominant, aggressive, hung tops. Queer Asian men are expected to be submissive, receptive bottoms. And whiteness is again treated as neutral, as something that could go whichever direction. The presumption of a black man being the top when he's with a white man and the white man being the top when he's with an Asian man is itself still a reflection of how masculinity is seen as relative, and how whiteness's perception of neutrality affects things. We replicate the same dynamics that exist within heterosexuality pretty straightforwardly. A white gay guy who quote-unquote surprises his parents by bringing home a black partner will get a very different reaction than if he brings home his Asian partner, or his white partner, or his Hispanic partner, or his Middle Eastern partner, or whoever. Gender dynamics are convoluted, and social acceptance is a tangled web of negotiated compromises and performances. Of, yes, being a gay man, but you're a top. Of, yes, being a bottom, but not for a feminine man. Of, yes, being a masculine white bottom, but not for an Asian man. And to be extremely clear here, this is not me saying that these are good things, just that they're examples of how the stereotypes, perceptions, and assumptions around masculinity and femininity don't just stop with cishet men and women. These dynamics run incredibly deep, and we are not immune from replicating them within marginalized communities to suit our own needs. The point is that nobody actually comes out on top when everyone's being made miserable by this shit. Nobody benefits from this absurd tendency to conflate everything with gender and from there let it be dictated by misogyny, and thankfully, we can all do our own little part to push back against this by just thinking about it more. The solution isn't to say that gay men can't play mercy or to advocate for rigid gender roles but wokely or whatever, but rather to reassess what inferences we make about a person based on something as silly as the role they play in a game, and the values that we apply to them as a result. Like I said, I did that whole study video, and there definitely are a lot of bottoms that play support, and that fact can be acknowledged and even joked about while still consciously choosing to recognize that the negative connotations associated with that role come from a more deeply rooted bias regarding gender. However, and this is a bit of a spoiler for that one I guess, it also must needs be remarked that a key takeaway from that video is that we are not as different as we are presumed to be. That these tendencies towards playing one role or character archetype or whatever else are far less dramatic than stereotypes would suggest. In particular, one of the biggest takeaways for our purposes is that even though a lot of women and queer people do have characters like Mercy in their most played, that didn't necessarily mean that they wanted to do that. It's just what they felt like they needed to do for whatever reason. When you look at who these people want to play or who their favorite characters are, it's basically all over the map, which to me says that these stereotypes really don't reflect what people want to do, just what they feel like they have to do. Part of why queerness has moved from horror to healer, from scary to support, from villain to, well, sometimes still villain, but in a deliberately slay way instead of a queer-coded evil kind of way, is that we've reevaluated the way we perceive gender and sexuality in society. And while that progress is obviously good, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything's going to be magically perfect now. Recognizing how deep these preconceptions around gender run and how they're a prison for everyone, including those who can use them to boost themselves off the back of others, is the first step in tackling those deep-seated issues and making things better for all of us. It's the first step in undoing some of the genuinely harmful social conditioning that we've internalized, in questioning why we perceive things the way that we do. It's the first step towards freeing yourself from those impulses to perform a role that doesn't bring you joy, and towards determining for yourself what it means to be you. It's an opportunity to allow yourself to be happy, to allow yourself to define yourself, to allow yourself to live your life as you choose rather than as it is prescribed for you. It is an opportunity to stop cutting yourself off from the bounty of opportunities that exist for you in life once you stop feeling the pressure to avoid food, drinks, clothes, activities, colors, professions, mannerisms, emotions, and so much more because of what they might do to your credibility under your gender roles. It is an opportunity to find happiness in the people around you who can bring you joy as human beings, not as a collection of attributes that you evaluate through the lens of either succeeding or failing to perform them adequately. And it's also the first step in putting an end to this annoying genre of bottomsby shopping humor that the internet has been really fascinated with lately for some stupid fucking reason, which alone is a good enough reason in my books. But hey, maybe you feel a bit robbed by this video. Maybe you wanted to know more about whether the bottoms do in fact be playing Mercy, and what the prevalence of supports among the queers really is. If that's the case, I strongly encourage you to go check out a study into who the girls, gays, and theys mean and why, where I dive into that more deeply. And hey, now's the perfect time to do so, because this video is over. Thank you very much for watching, I hope you've enjoyed, and if you did, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more. I also want to thank Ocean the Harpy, who was the top Donathon donor and picked this topic. I am so sorry that this video was as delayed as it was. The original plan had been for it to come out in June as a Pride thing, but Danganronpa once again was an LGBT foe, with the V3 video taking up all my time. Hopefully this video is worth the wait, but if not, well, we've got a few more coming up soon. Here's the schedule for the upcoming videos as of right now. September 7th, Elite beat agents and the games killed by changing console gimmicks. September 21st, mythical Pokemon were a bad idea that's only gotten worse with time. October 4th, the sequel makeover, how Overwatch handled updating its character designs, which is also the beginning of the 3rd anniversary Donathon. October 5th, making a mascot, ruining a character. And October 12th, what it means to hate a game for content. There's also the process of elimination video, which will probably come out in late October, as well as the September and October members' choice videos, which will be either out in October or November, depending on what people pick. The other day, I realized that in the time it took me to put out 9 videos in 2025, I'd put out literally double that in 2024, so I'm trying my best to crunch and catch up a bit before the end of the year, so I'm at least at a decent number. For the Donathon itself, I couldn't get the time off that I wanted to for October. Unfortunately, being employed is in fact a curse. So instead, the way it's going to work is that it'll be a capped Donathon starting on October 4th, and from the 4th to the 20th, I'll be doing regular streams while working on videos and also actually working. Then, from the morning on the 21st to the end of the day on the 26th, we'll be going 24/7 on Twitch with a bunch of streams, including some streams with friends. The specific schedule will be set up once I know my work schedules for those weeks, and the Donathon incentives will be set up once I know what I'm going to do for any of it. Also, don't forget to pre-order your Wiggler pins if you haven't already. I made a post about it before and mentioned it at the beginning of the video, but for Americans, this will be your only opportunity to get them for the foreseeable future. The shipping company that the artist uses has stopped shipping to America on account of the tariffs, so we're going to be doing a bit of a workaround to make sure you can still get your pre-orders. But it's one that I won't be able to afford to continue doing beyond those pre-orders. Pre-orders are still open for everyone until September 5th, so if you really want one but haven't pre-ordered it yet, make sure to go do so ASAP. Link to that is in the description. There's also the September Members' Choice video that starts tomorrow. The topics are: how Buried Stars gets social media toxicity right. This video would be a return to Buried Stars, focusing specifically on how it portrays social media toxicity through its Twitter stand-in Fader, and how the toxicity impacts each of the characters differently. Why social skills actually matter in competitions. This video would explore how social skills work as both offensive and defensive tools in competitive environments, and why that's important. The content creator crisis of the commons. This video would explore how online content is in a uniquely modern crisis of the commons, and how that impacts the relationships between viewers, creators, and content. Gen AI is a society-wide prisoner's dilemma, and we're not going to solve it in time. This video would be about the nature of the economic time bomb that is generative AI, and why the people with the power to defuse it are basically guaranteed to refuse to do so until it's too late. Memberships cost $5 a month through YouTube or Patreon, both of which are linked down below, and voting will run from September 1st to September 10th. Last thing, but thank you very much to all my channel members. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you to Adele and Robot Juice. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise, Andrew Tanar, Bailey Nichols, and Cavi Corbin. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Cadence, Marsh Alice, Gavos, Crimson Cyclo, Corey, MV, The Only Enigma, Mariah, Aman Dadley, Meep Cubed, Noisy Pitta, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Deku _ Safon, Lala the Bambi, JMD Toaster, Ginkgo, Teo Tamara, and Please Like Me. Whether you're a member, a subscriber, or you just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.